Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrea Nandoskar, and I'm the Education Program Manager at Historic Hawaii Foundation. Thank you for joining us for the fourth lecture of the 34th Annual Experts at the Cathedral Lecture Series. Mahalo to our event partner, Dr. Ralph Kam, the curator and coordinator of the Expert Series, on behalf of the Historic Preservation Program, Department of American Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. HHF is pleased to co-sponsor this year's series, which explores the changing interpretations of national historic landmarks. Before we begin, a few virtual housekeeping items. We're recording today's presentation, and the video replay will be available on the HHF website next week. We're also live streaming this talk on the YouTube and Facebook pages, where it will be available for viewing immediately afterwards. If you have questions during the talk and immediately afterwards, please type them in the chat box on the Zoom menu bar. We will have time at the end to answer questions, and we'll do our best to address as many as we can. For those new to Historic Hawaii Foundation, we are a statewide nonprofit that helps people save historic places, sites that tell the stories of the multi-layered history of Hawaii. We do this through education, advocacy, assistance, and protection of and for historic places. I'd now like to warmly welcome Dr. Ralph Kam, who will provide a brief introduction to the Lahaina Historic District.
Thank you, Andrea. So we have the opportunity to look at a historic district over time. So I've prepared a set of slides that show the changes in the statement of significance. Next. So this is the Lahaina Historic District. It's the old section of town. Plus it goes out into the ocean because Lahaina was a seaport, and out in the ocean was an area where the ships anchored. So this was the original focus of the nomination for the Lahaina Historic District. Next. So fortunately, we have statements of significance that are designed to state why something is being nominated as a National Historic Landmark. And this is the one that first appeared in 1962. Perhaps no island town so well preserves the atmosphere of a mid-19th century Hawaiian seaport as does Lahaina. And thus it seems to be the key site for illustrating and commemorating one of the broad factors which resulted in the Americanization of Hawaii and which helped lead eventually to the annexation of the islands to the United States, the whaling industry. So this is this focus is on the whaling industry. It continues on talking about the whaling industry, and then next. Almost as an afterthought. In addition, Lahaina was the royal residence and capital during much of the critical period when Hawaii was changing from a feudal autocracy to the constitutional monarchy, and it was associated with many key events of that transition. So you can see that it's focusing on the whaling industry. Almost as an afterthought, you have a royal residence in Lahaina. Next. This is 1972, so 10 years later. Lahaina preserves the atmosphere of mid-19th century Hawaiian seaport. The same thought is continuing. It is prominently associated with American whaling industry in the Pacific, an important commercial activity that was influenced the Americanization of Hawaii and its subsequent annexation by the United States. As a former capital of Maui, it was intermittently the residence of Hawaiian kings. American missionaries made Lahaina a center of activity and left important architectural influences. So you see the shift from just whaling and Americanization to include a more prominent role for Hawaiian kings, and then the inclusion of the American missionaries, because a number of the buildings in the historic district were built by missionaries. Next. Then in 1974, you have another rewrite. The American whalers, businessmen and missionaries who headquartered in the port town of Lahaina during the many decades of the 19th century generated economic, cultural, and governmental conditions that made great contributions to the Americanization of the Kingdom of Hawaii. So you still have Americanization. You've included whalers, businessmen, and missionaries up front. Really, you've lost the royalty at this point. And Lahaina preserves the atmosphere and architecture of a mid-19th century Hawaiian seaport. Again, this is the focus of the Lahaina Historic District in 1974. Next. So this is what is on the website for the National Park Service, Lahaina Historic District. And you can see a change in emphasis. So Lahaina Historic District, located in the town of Lahaina on the island of Maui, was once the capital of the Hawaiian Kingdom. So once again, you're bringing the focus back on the Hawaiian Kingdom. Americanization is gone, although it still has whaling in here. The town was a favorite site of Hawaiian kings and queens, whaling ships, and missionaries. So you have a prominent mix of the influences in Lahaina, including Hawaiian kings and queens. The historic district covers both land and sea and encompasses the entire old town of Lahaina, as well as the waters 1 mile out from the historic section of the town. Next. So you can see that in 1962, you had all of the buildings that were considered principal historic structures and sites were from either missionaries or from the whaling industry. And they included the Carthaginian 1 and the Carthaginian 2, which were props for the movie Hawai'i. Next. So missing from the 1962 study of the principal historic structures and sites was Moku ula, which our speaker today will be emphasizing, and it's a focus on a site that was not included in the 62 study, but over the years has become more and more important. So I think you'll enjoy the talk by Ron Williams Jr. today, and that is all I have on this topic.
Thank you, Dr. Cam. Michelle, you can close the PowerPoint. Thank you. Mahalo for providing the background on the Lahaina Historic District, Dr. Cam. I'd now like to introduce and welcome today's speaker. Dr. Ron Williams Jr. holds a Ph.D. in history with a specialization in Hawaii and native, native language resources. He's setting up his PowerPoint for us. He is a former faculty member within the Hawaii Nuakea School of Hawaiian Knowledge at UH Manoa and served as the founding director of the Lahui Hawaii Research Center. He is a past president of the 128-year-old Hawaiian Historical Society. Currently, Dr. Williams owns and operates a research and writing business and works as an archivist at the Hawaii State Archives. He also serves as Ho'opa'a Ku'auhau historian for Ka'ahahui Hawaii Aloha Aina. Dr. Williams has published in a wide variety of academic and public history venues, including the Oxford Encyclopedia of Religion in America, the Hawaiian Journal of History, and Hanaho Magazine. Welcome, Dr. Williams.
Aloha mai. Aloha mai kākou. O vau Ron Williams Jr. He mea kakao vau, he mea Akewika vau, he me ko ho'opua ho'opa'aku au hauvau. Malahini vau I ke ia wahi o kona, I ka moku o kona, I ka mokopuni o Oahu, I kohova I paiaina. No laila, e ho'omaka vau I ku'u mo'oku au hau. Okay, so my name is Ron Williams Jr. I'm a Malahini, I'm a visitor to Hawaii. I came here in 1997. And so my training has always been to start with my mo'oku au hau, familial and academic. So I'll start there. I'll keep it brief. My father is Ron Williams Sr., Big Ron. He comes from Arkansas, a long line of farmers, fishermen, and so forth. My mother is Janet Marie LaBounty. She comes from Chicago, where I was born. Her people come back from Montreal, and before that, from Wales, Ireland, and France. So that's who I am. My academic mo'oku au hau. I went back to school at a later age. I was 33, living in Lahaina, working at Moku ula actually, and also a waiter job to pay the bills. And I went back to school at Maui Community College in 2001. Came out to UH Oahu in 2003. I was at the Center for Hawaiian Studies, Kumu Akana, under Dr. Trask and Dr. Kamei Lahiva and Dr. Osorio. I got my BA in Hawaiian Studies there. I got an MA in Pacific Island Studies at UH, and then I received my Ph.D. in Hawaiian History in 2013. So that's who I am. I'm very honored to be here today. Thankful for the audience. We're on technology today that I don't really understand, but I'm impressed because here I am. Oops. Here I am. Oops. This looks like I need my camera. Yes.
Okay, you can turn your camera on and bring back your screen. There you go. We can see you now.
Okay.
He's doing this on his phone.
But I can't see the presentation, so
No, it's not up now. And let us know if you need us to help with that. Why don't you take your time and bring it back up?
Yeah, if I go to the presentation, though, I think it's going to take me off the screen, but we'll see.
Oh, that's fine then. Don't worry about it.
Okay.
Try again to bring it up. And if
go.
you're not on screen, that's fine.
Okay. Okay, how's that look?
We don't see your presentation.
Oh, okay. How am I for the trouble? Okay, let's see. Okay, yeah, I don't think it's gonna let me do both at the same time. So
That's fine. You can just.
You'll be gifted without having to look at my face. Okay. So yeah,
it's not up, Ron.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, the presentation's not up, and we can jump in if you need us to.
Okay. 1 second. We had it. Okay, is that it?
I don't see it.
Okay. Shoot. We had it. Okay, let's start over. Okay. Zoom. Share content. Screen. Okay. Start broadcast. Okay. Keynote.
We've got it.
Okay. Sorry, folks.
Super.
Yes.
No worries. Carry
As
on.
you mentioned, I'm on my phone on my lunch break, so but it's pretty impressive that we're here, and I'm out on the lawn at Iolani Palace. So to get back to the story, so what I'm talking about today is that transformation. Yeah, is that move from that history of Lahaina in the 1960s and 70s to what it is today. And that move, that change, can really be summed up with one word, and that's historiography. As a historian, historiography is the process of the creation of history, right? It's how we came up with what we know and how we came up with what we don't know, right? And over the last 100 years in Hawaii, that historiography has been wrapped around a methodology that's very problematic, that's exclusive. And so we've had that understanding of Lahaina and many other places through that faulty historiography, that exclusive historiography. All that has been changing. It's really a revolution. Starting in the 1970s and moving on for the next 30 or 40 years now, we've had a change to include Native voice. And the main way is through Hawaiian language resources. Not the only way, but the main way. And so we're including not only the Hawaiian language newspapers, but tens of thousands of legal documents, of correspondence, of things like that in Hawaiian to the stories that we're hearing. It's really changing what we understand. So I'm going to give you a kind of a blow by blow and show you how that's changed this story of Lahaina and Moku ula. Okay, so historiography in Hawaii. So the 95, here I'll put up here, approximately 95% of the published material about Hawaii and Hawaiians comes from English language sources, right? Now think about that. And that's today. If you go into the library today, the state library today, and you pull books off the shelf about Hawaii, about 95% of them will be from English language sources exclusively. And the contention isn't that the English sources lie and Hawaiian sources tell the truth. The contention is that you've gotten a very small part of the story, right? You've seen a murder and you've got 10 witnesses and you've taken the story from one guy and walked away, right? Well, we're starting to include more witnesses. We're starting to include that native voice. Helen Chapin writes in her book on newspapers in Hawaii that about 6% of the population were fluent in English at that time. We're writing and speaking in English at the time of the overthrow, the 6%. So if you think that we've got 95% of our history from 6% of the population, and again, not to say that it's all wrong, but to say that that exclusivity left out native voice, and those stories are starting to change what we understand about Hawaii and Hawaiians, right? We're starting to learn from Hawaiians, not about Hawaiians, okay? Some of the most productive or most prolific writers of Hawaiian history at that period were men like Reverend Sereno Edwards Bishop, William DeWitt Alexander, who was president of the Board of Education, and President Sanford Dole. So the things that these men and many others wrote became the history of these spots that we know, okay? So I call it claiming and reclaiming space on the historical landscape, right? It's a very powerful tool to claim space, whether physically or whether in people's minds with a story. And that's been done, for over a century in Hawaii through those primary stories. And so what we know, this spot I'm showing you here, what we know about it today is that it's a baseball field, right? It's a county park and so forth. But there's a much larger story that was uncovered that talks about Moku ula. Now, many of you have probably heard the Olelo no Iao, quote, Olelo no Iao, I ka wā mamua ka wā mahope, right? In the future is the past. Now, I said that there's one answer to why this thing has changed. With all due respect to the thousands of people that have been involved over the 3 decades that Moku ula has been around, there's really, in my mind, there's one man who's responsible for this project getting launched and being driven, and that is Kumu Akana. Yeah, Kumu Akana was the man who founded the Friends of Moku ula, was the first executive director with others, with Malia Ka'ai and others, founded the Friends of Moku ula, and he pushed and drove this thing into being. Now, when I went to look up Ika wā mamua ka wā mahope years ago, when I was citing it, I was looking in Mrs. Bukui's Olelo no Iao, and I couldn't find it. I went to other places and couldn't find it written as a no Iao. I talked to Auntie Pat Bacon, and she said, no, that's not a Olelo no Iao. And I come to find out, there's two registered articles that mention that it was a Koni who came up with this Ika wā mamua ka wā mahope. So looking to the future, looking to the past to build the future was really his idea. He used to say it every day, along with other things, was his kind of push for all of us to start to examine the past again. Okay. So Ralph mentioned briefly this report that was done, issued in 1962. It was conducted in 1961. The Board of Supervisors in Lahaina wanted to find out all of the important historical places in Lahaina for 2 reasons. Number one, they wanted to save them. And number 2, tourism. This was a very growing industry, and they wanted stories to tell. And so they hired a company called Community Planning Incorporated from Honolulu to come over and do the history of Lahaina, kind of the official history of Lahaina. And to note, they had no Hawaiian language speakers on their staff. It wasn't, to be fair, it wasn't quite an issue in the 1960s. And so they produced this report, again, from very exclusive voices. Part of my master's thesis was on the church in Lahaina, Keopuolani's church, and it comes out in a completely different story in this report than what the research today shows. So they put out this report that became other reports and other documents and so forth. So we have a 200-year history of Lahaina as an economic, social, and religious center of the Hawaiian Islands, but from that 6% voice. Okay? As Ralph mentioned, one of the big ones is whaling, right? We've got plenty of the whaling history out of that report. The other one was the missionaries. We've got plenty of those stories of the missionaries. And I remember Kumu Akana, when I worked there and when I was there, used to always talk about, that was kind of his theme. They've been talking about the 200-year history of Moku ula in Lahaina, we've been living here for 2,000 years, right? So his mission was to bring back that 2,000-year-old history of the area. He trained myself and many others to give cultural history tours of Lahaina that talked about that 2,000-year-old history. Okay, so out of that report came other reports from the Maui Historical Society, from the Lahaina Restoration Foundation, and so forth. And they kept building on that 1961 report and repeating those narrow stories. Now, as I mentioned, Kumu Akana is the founder of and the first executive director of Moku ula. He was a Kamehameha Schools graduate. He was a kumu hula, a haku mele. He wrote songs and chants. Many of his songs were recorded by stars you probably know. And he worked at the Ka'anapali Beach Hotel in Ka'anapali. And today that's kind of known as the Hawaiian Hotel on Maui. If you ever go Sunday brunch, that's the place to go. But he was working there at the Ka'anapali Beach Hotel when he was introduced to an idea that kind of changed his life. And I'll talk about that in just a second. He also helped found Hula o Nakeki, a youth chant and dance contest at the hotel itself. Okay, so he tells the story when he was at the hotel working. This Po'okela program was started in 1986. And it was quoted to be a groundbreaking culture-based initiative begun by George Hueo Kanahele. So George Kanahele came to the hotel and started talking about this idea of culture-based tourism and really grounding the experience in culture. And Akoni at the time, and I'll share some stories that I'm sure he'd laugh about today. But when I started at Moku ula, I saw him as he was one of the most knowledgeable men I've ever met, and just incredibly deep knowledge of culture and chant and places and so forth. But when I met him, he pulled me aside one day and he said, Ron, he said, this space, Moku ula, when I used to come out here, when I was introduced to it by Kumu Kanahele, he said, that was the place that me to hang out and get drunk and drink beers. And it's true. Moku ula was kind of a waste dump. There was a park to the west side, and the east side was a place where garbage was and people hung out and so forth. And so he said, I was one of those guys sitting over there drinking beer every day, not really being connected to my past. And that all changed when George Kanahele challenged him and said, your kuleana is to know your history, know the places that you're at. And so that began the process for Kumu Akana. Do your homework, read, listen to the voices of the kapuna, both living and past. Something, again, he drilled into our heads every day. Do your homework. Do your homework. That's the thing that sparked the interest in me to actually end up going back to school. What is Malauulu o Elele County Park? So at that time, it still was a baseball park, right? When I had joined, they had just shut down the park. And he used to always ask us, what is this place? And we're like, well, that's, he's like, you go find out. And so he encouraged us to do research along with his own. In 1990, he founded, along with the Board of Trustees, the Friends of Moku ula, and he was the founding executive director. Now there are many, as I mentioned, there are many, many, many people who helped along the way, many important people. And I just have time to mention a few of those folks that were there that I knew that kind of helped ground the project and so forth. And two of them are Ke'au Moku Kapu and his wife Uilani, longtime residents of Kaua'ula Valley, genealogy going back many generations in that area. Ke'au Moku was an alohe, or is an alohe, trains young men in lua. Aloha Aina, both of them are Aloha Aina. They work their land, they take care of their land, they preserve their land. Both of them are mahiai. They plant up in the valley, and they're organizers. Ke'au Moku is one of the best known organizers in West Maui for bringing people forward to look at and to understand and to confront issues that affect Hawaiian history. And as I mentioned, their genealogy comes from Moku ula. Another person is Mahina Martin. She was the program director at the Friends of Moku ula. Mahina started a program called Maui Nei Tours that started introducing that 2,000-year-old history of Moku ula to tourists that arrived by boat, right? In Lahaina, you have the tourist vessels coming in every day, almost every day. You have thousands of people flooding into Lahaina town, and they're getting that experience of walking up and down Front Street. And Akoni and Mahina said, let's give them part of this history. And they trained some of us to do these tours where we walk the people through the area and explain to them that 2,000-year-old history. Another important part of the program was Kumu Kekoa Yap. He is a kumu hula also, and a minister, and a cultural practitioner and advocate. Kumu Kekoa was one of those many people who offered Akoni support. the thing about Akoni, I can be clear about is he was demanding. I've never seen anyone as driven about a project as he was about Moku ula. I've been on many projects myself, and he was going to see this happen and carry that along. And people like Kekoa are ones that supported him in that project. So Kumu Akana, change through dedication and kuleana. So I mentioned historiography was the tool. The reason, iko omana'o, in my mind, that Moku ula happened was because of Akoni. He was that dedicated. He was that driven. Mahina Martin said of him, Akoni had the rare gift of connecting today's world with the lessons of the past. He understood early on that the sacredness of Moku ula was to be protected and acknowledged that in today's world, we could learn so much. Yeah. Senator J. Kalani English, a longtime friend and resident of Maui, friend of Akoni. He's today the Senate Majority Leader in the House in the Hawaii State Legislature. Senator English said Akoni was always so driven. He did his research, read books, but never stopped seeking out more. He made sure to go sit and talk with the ohana and the kupuna. Yeah, everyone understood that drive that Akoni had. And then Kekoa said in an article that I wrote for Hanaho magazine last year, he was quoted as saying, "We Hawaiians have lost a lot, but we still have hope. Hope is what Moku ula represents. Akoni gave us that hope, and I'll always aloha him for that." Yeah, and he gave lots of us hope. He gave me a career in education. This is Akoni and one of his haumana, your broadcaster today with actual hair. So this was my nod to him and how he pushed me along that path. He taught us Olelo Hawai'i. I remember one of the things that Kumu Akana did was that he insisted that I learn a word a day. He said, "I'll give you this word," because I can be anxious. I can be kind of wanting to learn more. And he said, "I'm going to give you one word and you learn that word. Learn it forward and backwards." And of course, if I would have kept doing that, it would have taken me 7 lifetimes to learn Hawaiian. But he was trying to make the point that you treasure each word, that you watch what you say. Ikolelo keola, ikolelo kumake. In language, there's life. In language, there's death. He taught us those stories. Oli, he took us around the east side of Maui one time by horseback and was naming every creek that came down and every path and these types of things and telling us stories. And we came up to the Lion's home, Lion's Noni out there, and we get out of the van. It's Kumu and myself and another student, another wahine. And Kumu said, "Okay, Oli," because we were going to Oli and ask permission to come in. And I looked at her. I was nervous. I had just started learning Hawaiian and so forth. So I looked at her. I said, "Okay, you Oli." And she looked at me. And she said, "No, you Oli." And I looked, "No, you Oli." And he Oli'd. And then we got back in the van and he gave us lickings. I mean, verbal lickings. But he made this point that I'll never forget. And that was, he said, "I didn't tell you to Oli perfectly. I didn't tell you to, it's not about you. It's not about your ego. It's about a process. It's about something you're doing. So Oli." Yeah. So I just share that story because that's, this man who led this project, these are the types of things that he passed out to thousands of people. Yeah. What is your kuleana? And what is that story? Your kuleana to that story. Okay. So moving on, Akoni passed in 2011. He had diabetes and was a short, thin, redheaded Portuguese Hawaiian who nevertheless was sick. And I saw him the last 3 or 4 years of his life at Moku ula, at work in the office, 14 hours a day. He was that dedicated. Hokalani Hope, Cultural Programs Director of the Maui Arts and Cultural Center, when presenting Akoni with a Celebration of the Arts Award last year, said, "The first and foremost thing, however, that fulfills his life and will, I know to his dying breath, is Moku ula." Yeah, and that was true. So what is Moku ula? I'm going to take a little bit of time now and say, what is Moku ula? I'm going to step out of the rain. Just for a second. Okay. What is Moku ula? So Moku ula is a space that was quoted by Christian Klieger, the archaeologist, as being an axis mundi of the Hawaiian world, like a center of the Hawaiian world. Ralph talked earlier about Lahaina being the capital of Hawaii. Moku ula was the sacred, spiritual, economic, and political capital of Hawaii for almost 7 generations. Yeah. I'm going to skip through these. So Moku ula, again, an axis mundi of the Hawaiian world. What you see there is Moku Hunia. Moku Hunia is a 17-acre fish pond, an inland fish pond, just about 150 yards in from Lahaina Beach. and it was a fish pond with an island on the fish pond. So there's an approximately maybe 1.5 acre, 2 acre island on the fish pond that was the residence of Pi'ilani and many of the ruling chiefs of Maui. When Kauikeaouli came to power, Kamehameha III came to power, he occupied Moku ula and used it as a place to get away from the growing presence of commerce and business and politics that was happening just a few hundred yards away. Many of us know that the 1840 Constitution for the Kingdom of Hawaii was signed in Lahaina. Luaehu was the area, which was the red pit, right? And all of those political machinations that were going on and Kauikeaouli was doing, this was his respite, was this island of Moku ula. Okay. So Moku ula was a political center. It was a wahikat kalai aina. As I mentioned, it was the nation's first capital. It was a wahimana, a spiritual center. Kalua o Kiha. So Kiha is kind of the missing part I haven't talked about yet. Kiha is the mo'o goddess of Mokuhinia Pond. Akoni was obsessed with Kiha in a good way. Always talking about her kuleana, always talking about the way that she brought power to Moku ula. Now, Kiha Wahine was an actual woman, a daughter of Pi'ilani, a human woman. She died at about 19 years old, 20 years old, and was deified in the waters of Moku ula there and came back as Kiha Wahine, the mo'o goddess. Her genealogy goes specifically to many people, but specifically to Keopuolani, right? So when Keopuolani comes back to that area and founds a Christian church a couple hundred yards away from Moku ula, Kiha Wahine is one of the connections there to her genealogy and to Kamehameha's unification of the island. Okay, Wahi Ohana Kalepa is an economic center. Pakala and the trading hubs were right there at Moku ula. Okay, if you think about the geography of that area, Ahupua'a we know stretched usually, not always, but usually from mountain to sea. There are usually these other square districts and so forth. Moku ula was based on a concentric circles of power. If you look at this, the land of Moku ula, it actually crosses two Ahupua'a. There's Waine'e and Waiokamo, Waine'e and Waiokamo. And this is a circle that starts within those and broadens out. The innermost part of the circle is Moku ula, was where the mo'i, the king, reigned. From there, moving out, you have Kalua o Kiha, which was the fish pond, right? Kalua Ehu, the larger pond, and then Lahaina itself. So the Ali'i would gather there around Moku ula for centuries, up until the 1840s and 50s. So here is Kiha. Kiha Wahine, Mokuhinia, Kalama ula, Kala Aheyana was this daughter of Pi'ilani who was the spiritual focus and the spiritual power behind Moku ula. Her mother was La'i'e Lohe Lohe Ikawai. Her father was Pi'ilani, and she was born at Epa. Epa is a disfigured is not the right word. It's born a different form than a normally formed human child, and that usually meant something prolific. That usually meant something. It was a prophecy of spiritual power within that child. So she was born at Epa, and again lived to about 20 or 21 years old before she passed. Samuel Kamakau talks about these mo'o as being up to 20 feet long and being these terribly dangerous, frightening creatures. And Kamakau talks about them being sighted by thousands upon thousands of people. And so this mo'o in particular, Kiha Wahine, this is one of her homes there at Moku ula. Now these photographs. So let me go back. This image is the image that I had always seen of Kiha. I wasn't aware of any of the existence of any of the ki'i left of her. This was a drawing made by Barnfeld of the statue, the ki'i, the actual ki'i, that was discovered on Lapahoihoi Iki in the Big Island, Hawaii Island, in 1880s, and taken by Professor Arning, who was a bacteriologist from Germany, who came to Hawaii to study leprosy. Dr. Arning took this image back to Germany with him. He was allowed to by Kalakaua as long as they made an image of it. And so they made this drawing of it. But so that image today is in a natural history museum, an ethnographic museum in Berlin. A colleague of mine was there and I was freaking out and I said, you have to take pictures. So he did send me these pictures of the actual image, which are here. You'll notice Kiha in a different pose than most ki'i you see. Yeah. Some kupuna I've talked to have mentioned that this might have been a birthing pose, but it is a different form than most Hawaiian kiki. You see the human teeth and the mother of pearl eyes. Yeah. So this was discovered once again, and it is the singular one from that period that was discovered in the 1880s on Hawaii Island. So a map of Moku ula brings us to this idea of, here's on the, I think you're seeing it like I am, the far left is the ocean, right? And then you see this, whoops, you see this image of Moku ula there in blue, right, is the pond. And the yellow part within the blue is the island of Moku ula. And there was a tomb there. There was a mausoleum built by Kawikioli for the bodies of his family. When his sister, Nahiena dies, they had, in September of 1836, Kawikioli and Nahiena had a child, and the child was to be the next, not only mo'i, but in the traditional sense, the next akua, right? With that much power to solve this problem of death from disease that was plaguing Hawaii. And so this feather pa'u was created for her. They had this union. The child died after only a few hours, and Nahiena dies a few weeks later, actually December 30th, 1836. So when Nahiena dies, Kawikioli refuses to part with her body. He's so grief-stricken. He brings her to Haleoluhe, which was his house out near Queen's Hospital today. And he keeps her there. And the papers are asking, when are you going to return her? When are you going to bury her? And he finally has a funeral for her on February 4th, 1837, at the site of Kawaiaha'o Church. But then he takes her back to his home after the funeral. In April of 1837, so 4 months later, he hires a ship called the Kitote. He buys a ship called the Kitote, and they travel with her body over to Lahaina to bury her. An incredible ceremony happens. These are some of the stories that are uncovered by Akoni in the Hawaiian language newspapers. They had a funeral march for her from Mala Wharf to Moku ula to bury her there at Moku ula with her mother, Keopuolani, right? They actually cut down breadfruit trees. They laid out lauhala mats, put down ili, and they made this procession from Mala. I would guess it's about 1.5 miles, 2 miles, maybe a little longer, over to Moku ula and buried her there at Moku ula. Okay, so that's the map. This is another map of the church, the Christian church that Keopuolani founded. Is the brown building there? Yeah, you'll see the burial grounds, or the red part. Many of the highest elite in the kingdom are buried there. When we talk about Mana Ala and some of the other royal burials, this burial site in Lahaina rivals any other spot in Hawaii. I mean, the burials there we'll see in a minute, but this was where Keopuolani is buried and brought back many of the elites with her there. To the left, the interesting part that I wanted to show you is to the left there, you see the fish pond starting, right? So Mokuhinia fish pond went up to the border of the church. There's a wall right there. And the part between the water and the cemetery was kalo. They had planted kalo. But so this 17-acre fish pond literally brushed up right against the church. Yeah. So some of the royal burials at Waine'i Cemetery. We have Keopuolani, again. Nahiena, right? Kaumoali'i is buried there next to Keopuolani per his request. We have Ulumahehe Ho'opili, Kalakua Kahehe Malie, Kekau Nohi, and Liliha, among others. So some of the highest ranking ali'i in the Kingdom of Hawaii were buried there at the cemetery. Now, the interesting part in the connection to Moku ula is that some of them, including Keopuolani and Nahiena, were originally buried at Moku ula. There are stories by ship captains and others in the 1837, 38, 40 of Kawikioli bringing them ashore, meeting them, and taking them to visit his family in the mausoleum, right? So that mausoleum there at Moku ula held the bodies of Nahiena and Keopuolani from the 1820s and 1830s for Nahiena up until the 1880s. Now in 1880s, Pernice Pauahi Bishop and others started a project to reunite all of the iwi, the iwi back on Oahu. It wasn't just an island preference thing. It was the fact that some of these burials were not being taken care of as well. And some of them were being almost forgotten about and so forth. We'll talk about what happened to Moku ula in a second, but at Moku ula, the place had become run down. The capital had moved to Oahu in 1850. I hear often quoted as the 1840s, but 1850, well, the Ali'i had moved to Honolulu earlier, but Honolulu became the capital of the Hawaiian Islands in 1850 by declaration. And so you have Ali'i moving from Lahaina, from Moku ula, to this new capital of Honolulu, and the area being kind of run down. Mosquitoes came, peely grass, and the place became kind of a large swamp. So Bernice Pauahi Bishop was worried about this, and she put out this call to bring the iwi to Oahu or to take care of them in some other way. And she dies soon afterwards. But in 1883-84, we have the burials of Keopolani Nahiena being removed from Moku ula in a midnight ceremony, a late night ceremony, to the Christian church about 200 yards away and buried there at Waine'e Church. Yeah, today it's called Waiolo Church. So we have that moving of burials from Moku ula, the most sacred burials, up to Waiolo Church. Okay. Here's an earlier map, as the 1820, late 20s, I think. You'll see the beach here on the bottom, Main Street, which is today called Front Street. On the left side, you'll see Prison Street, and on the right side, you see Coconut Street, which is today the Shaw Street. Okay. You'll see once again the island of Moku ula, the larger Mokuhinia Pond, the church, and the plantings of kalo there. Okay. So Moku ula and the church. I mentioned a little about this. Oh, this is one I want to hold off. Okay. So the church that Keopolani founded was founded as Ebenezer Church in 1832 by Ho'opili. He gave the land to the mission, and they founded the best built, largest, two-story, sat 3,000 people at a service church there on those grounds just outside of Moku ula. The writings that we have from that period talk about 3,000 attendees at church twice on Sundays. So 6,000 people coming. Again, where Keopolani went to church, everyone went to church, right? So you have that area built up. You have the church. The church burns in 1894. The church is rebuilt and so forth. And we didn't have any images of the church for about a 60-year period. About 4 years ago, in my dissertation research, myself and John Barker, who was the curator or the archivist at Hawaiian Mission Houses Museum, discovered this image of the actual church, which, the reason I'm showing you today is, which also shows Moku ula. It's actually a photograph of Moku ula, which is incredible. It's one of the first daguerreotypes taken in Hawaii. David Forbes estimated it at circa 1853-54. But one of the first daguerreotype photos was taken from Front Street at the church. And so you literally have an image of what Moku ula looked like. And that's this image here. Okay. So again, not a drawing, but this is a photograph of the pond circa 1850s. So this would have been just after the Ali'i left to go to Honolulu. The pond's not run down yet, but you do see the rock walls, you see the water and so forth. Lots of underground springs fed this pond and also water coming down from the mountains to the pond. Now, of course, we know that sugar dominated Lahaina in the 1860s and 70s and 80s and on, and that sugar production diverted water coming down the mountains to the sugarcane fields, and that's one of the things that dries up Moku ula and causes it to become a swamp. Okay. So in 1837, I'll give you a little timeline here. In 1837, we have the funeral of Nahiena Ana being buried there at Moku ula. This image is from the 1880s, and it's that area of, and you can see it's kind of swampy now, but there still is water there. In the 1840s, the political and economic power of Oahu grows, and the Ali'i Nui follow. In the 1850s, Honolulu becomes the capital of Hawaiian Kingdom. The 1860s to the 1880s, Mokuhinia, not maintained, becomes overgrown mosquito-filled marsh. Okay, so in 1914, the territory of Hawaii filled in Mokuhinia Pond and covered Moku ula with coral and dirt. So that area was becoming quite useful, quite valuable. If you think about today, that area in Lahaina is probably one of the most expensive real estates, even including Waikiki. There's an incredibly well-received economic zone just to the right of it, to the west of it, and then you have Moku ula. So that area was filled in, covered in. It was also because of the mosquitoes and so forth, and it became this covered area. The land was leased by the kingdom as government land in the 1850s and 60s and 70s to different people. Sugar did lease the property for quite a while. And then in 1914, the territory covered it, took it back, and eventually is going to make it into a county park. Okay. This is a 2003, I believe, photograph that I took of Moku ula that today is dry, but it had rained, and it shows you how easily that water comes back to that area, not only from the rain, but from underground also. In 1990, Friends of Moku ula was founded by Akoni and others. In 1993, an archaeological survey was done by Dr. Christian Klieger at Bishop Museum to start to find out some of the basics of what was there and so forth. And they discovered the walls of the island about 1.5 feet underground. I mean, it was really that close at some spots, and they found it intact. They even found some of the wooden pier that was at the Mauka side of the island on the pond, where the Ali'i would get in the canoe and take the va up to church on Sunday, which was a couple hundred yards away. So they would, from the island, they could go to church by canoe. There's a story in the newspapers that's incredible, that one of the ones I believe Akoni found also, that talks about the chiefess Manoa Noa, and it talks about her taking the canoe. It might be Manoa Noa, Kalamai, I don't want to quote that, it might be one of the other chiefesses. But this chiefess takes the canoe on Sunday from the island towards Wai'ola Church, and the canoe is upturned and knocked over, and she almost drowns because of the mo'o. The mo'o was protecting the area, and she was headed to church. But so those types of stories, they're in the newspapers from the 1860s and 70s, reminding Akoni and eventually others of this area. So in 93, that archaeological survey was done. In 1994, it went on the Hawaii State Register of Historic Places. In 1997, it went on the National Register of Historic Places. This is all through the work of Akoni and others. In 1999, they were finally able to convince the people to shut the park down. There had been 2 baseball fields there, and folks said, we want to play baseball, and so yet to get that idea across of this is a sacred area, it needs to be shut down, took a while. In 1999 was when they shut down that area. In 2001, it was nominated for a designation as a UN World Heritage Site. 2 things happened. The county did give Friends of Moku ula the lease, a 90-year lease for, I think it was $1 a year, to take over the property and to bring back Moku ula, which was huge. Again, very, very, very valuable land. But the county gives it to the Friends of Moku ula. They also give them the revenues from the parking lot that sit at the front of the area. So that gives the project some revenue. The next big thing that happened in about 2011 or 12. And I remember Akoni talking about this all the time. And, the best friend of every preservation project is an endangered animal. And so sure enough, the Hawaiian stilt was spotted at Moku ula. Pictures were taken, reports were written, and the idea became to restore the area to save this endangered species. If culture wasn't working as an argument, then maybe this would. The Bureau of Land Management and the Army Corps of Engineers bought into the project and decided to put up $5 million towards the project. The county of Maui, not officially, but we're passing resolutions getting to the idea of contributing $10 million to the project. And that was in 2012, 2015, after Akoni's death and after Shirley, who was his right person's hand. She passed also. So there was a new board, there was new people coming in, good people. But there became a different cry from the community and from others about what that place should look like and who should decide and so forth. And so this new roadblock happened that was who gets to decide what it's going to look like. The county, and I don't speak for any side in this, please, but I'm just reporting, but the county was saying to get the money, it has to become a wetlands, a fish pond, which means under federal regulations, it has to be this much water and this much and so forth and so forth and so forth. Some in the community had said, no, it's going to be the fish pond. The Corps of Engineers said, well, then we're going to take our $5 million and the county's going to take their $10 million. And that confrontation, I don't want to say confrontation, but that not able to agree on what that would look like, put a pause on the project that unfortunately has continued. And the project is stalled today. The Friends of Moku ula in the last year has dissolved. So the hard part of the project is understanding this move, this drive by Akoni to have this and others and many others. Akoni didn't own the project; it was a community project, but this drive to make it happen, and yet it's still not happened. Having said that, I want to make an argument in the close, that the work that Akoni and every single one of those people did on this project, literally thousands of people, the Kapus and many others, the work that they did put forward history, put forward education, changed lives, assigned kuleana. The doing of the project has changed thousands of lives and changed our understanding of that Hawaiian history, even though the project has not become what it was meant to be. Maybe it will in the future, but the project itself stands as it is. And I'll close by saying that this idea of changing interpretations of parks and so forth, this is the tip of the iceberg. Our understanding of Hawaiian voice, we've got 125,000 pages of Hawaiian language newspapers that we've barely touched. These stories, these understandings from a wide variety of people, and not just Hawaiian. We have Chinese voice, we have Pake, we have Kepani voice, we have all the Portuguese voice. We have these people of Hawaii in the 19th century talking about history and bringing us stories, and that's going to significantly change, I think, all of these projects moving forward. Okay, mahalo. I'll unshare.
Thank you, Ron.
I survived the rain.
I'm sorry you had to.
No.
There you are. Wow, that's really fascinating. I'm just looking to see if there's any questions. Ingrid asked, is Hawaii trying to get the image or statue of, I think it was Lahaina back from the Berlin Museum?
Oh, yes and no. I'm not involved in those talks. I was a cultural affiliate at Bishop Museum for a few years, and that project was talked about. And there's things going on that I don't know about. But what I'll say is there's a couple of complications. The image wasn't stolen. It was allowed by Kalakaua to go back to Germany by Arning. So you can't make an argument that it's pilfered or it's a stolen object. You can make a moral argument that it should be in Hawaii and so forth. And so that's the argument that's trying to be made today. Lots of museums are starting to repatriate things. We see that in Aotearoa and elsewhere. So I have hope that it will. And it just, to be honest with you, nothing against the German museum, but it literally has a placard that says Hawaiian goddess. Like they don't know anything about it. There's nobody there studying it. I mean, she came from here, and in my mind, she should be back here. But I don't know of any specific efforts right at the moment.
Thanks.
Yeah.
While we're waiting for some other questions to come in, I'm wondering, the story is so interesting as you relate it, of the uncovering of the further history of Moku ula. What lessons can we learn from this whole process? I think thinking about it in terms of preservation and how we try to include stories now from that we have not previously had information or access to, or didn't have a voice. How do we help to uncover other sites? What have we learned from this? Does it take one, steward who's going to fight for it continuously, or are there other ways to make that happen as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think two things. Number one, that idea of humility. What the project taught me, and what every project I work on nowadays teaches me, is humility. I have a Ph.D. in Hawaiian history, and I've studied it for 20 years, and I've done it. But I never do a project nowadays. I never do anything nowadays without realizing how much I don't know. When you, especially academics, but also museum folks and so forth, sometimes tend to be a little defensive about, I've got to come up with an interpretation for this. I've got to say something about it. And I'm supposed to be the expert. But I'm telling you, what we know about Hawaiian history from the 19th century is bits in a thimble compared to what's out there. And so I would say humility hopefully will allow us to move forward into these projects saying, wow, what a great opportunity for all of us to learn. It's not our fault. They cut Hawaiian language in 1896. They did many other things. It's not our fault. We don't know what happened, but we're learning. And so I think that's an important lesson to learn for these projects. The other thing is, I think having a single leader like that is important sometimes. But what I'm seeing happen in the community is aunties and uncles picking up projects. I work with a group called Hui Aloha, which is kind of a rebirth of the old Hui Aloha from the 19th century. Lynette Cruz guys and others, and they're out every day somewhere learning about a place, cleaning it up. Pohukaina, the burial site at Iolani Palace, which is a few hundred yards from me right now. They just picked up weed blowers and trash bags and come out here no one asked them to, and it's not, no one assigned them that kuleana. But I see things like that happening all around, and a part of every one of those projects is education. I think everybody understands now the value of an education, and the Hawaiian community and others are desirous of that education. So I think Moku ula for me did that, but I think that and other projects is doing that for everybody.
It's really important what you're speaking to. Thank you for that. Another question is, what type of structures were the mausoleum and residence of Kamehameha III?
There's a book called Moku Ula by Dr. Christian Klieger that came out in 2003. It's really a deep dive into that material. On the top of my head, I don't remember. Of course, it was stone. There might have been wood involved, but the book brings out in particular. His research was really good, and a lot of it included in that. So I'd recommend picking up that book. I think it might be out of publication, but it's a Bishop Museum publication. And it's Moku ula, the Maui Sacred Island.
Great. We'll include that in our follow-up email.
Yeah.
Ted would like to know, what stories were there in the recently translated Native Hawaiian newspapers about Moku ula?
Yeah, well, the ones I mentioned, and many others, the way I like to frame it for folks is, say you want to know about Hilo in 1870. Before this revolution in historiography, you would go to, well, I speak English, they had English language newspapers. So you'd go to the English language newspaper of Hilo and you'd read. And you'd read about Hilo and you'd learn about Hilo. Well, again, that was 6% of the population of Hilo. The Hawaiian language newspapers that were published that day had content that was different from newspapers nowadays. It was a very engaged community. Dr. Puakea Nogemeyer calls it the internet of that day, because everybody in the nation was writing into the newspapers saying, oh yes, do you remember this story? And do you remember that story? And so like the stories from the Maka'ainana and the people and others are there in the newspapers. So going back to that material, changes everything we know. And again, I'd be clear that it's not always different. It's not always wrong. It's not that one side lies and one side tells the truth, but sometimes it's true. But it's that you have such a much more complicated understanding of that issue.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think you brought up a good point too, in that we have to put ourselves in the lens of the time when we're looking at information and understanding how the world was different. So we have to, yeah. Phil has a question. Was there controversy with the Hawaiian community, et cetera, about filling in the pond in 1914?
That's a good question. I don't know for a fact. My guess is that there was some, but I don't think that it was widespread, and I don't think it was organized. You have to remember, by that period, by 1917, we have the Americanization of Hawaii. We have the beginnings of tourism. We have Lahaina becoming that kind of port. And for most folks around that area, the stories are already, we're 3 or 4 generations from the stories, and it's a mosquito-filled swamp, so it's a nuisance. If you think about it, I wasn't part of this, but Oconee and those guys had to argue for a couple of years to get the folks to stop playing softball there. So it's just it's an ignorance of the history that history that education solves.
Yeah, I think that I was going to ask if this history is taught statewide, or is it taught in the public school system about Moku ula, especially in Maui, but all over, because it was important for the whole kingdom.
Right. Yes and no. We've worked with some of the Office of Hawaiian Education, OHE, within the DOE. We've worked with them, and they do put curriculum out. I produced a curriculum about the burials at Lahaina for the Friends of Waine'e, Nakia'io Waine'e, the Guardians of Waine'e. So that's a church group there that runs the graveyard. I produced a curriculum for them that's available to the public. It talks about all of those burials in that area of Moku ula and in the church. So there is stuff out there. It's kind of spotty. Again, the idea is, I told my friend, you could post topics to a dartboard and pick, and nobody's done that yet. through the Hawaiian language newspapers. It's really an open field. So we're going to see it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams.
Yeah.
Thanks to everyone so much for joining us. I'm sorry that we have to say goodbye. There was a few more questions, so we'll see if we can maybe get those answered from Dr. Williams in a separate venue. I want to thank everyone for joining us, especially thank you for being outside. Look at your backdrop.
I know.
And it started raining.
It was fun.
And you did it on your phone.
Fun. I hope it was
really was
viewable.
It definitely was. And just to remind everyone, the presentations are live streaming right now on Facebook and YouTube, the HHF ones. And the presentation looked great on there. So you can also refer back to that. I'd like to thank my colleague, Michelle Kisek, who has been providing technical support, and want to invite everyone to join us next Thursday on February 25th at noon for the 5th Experts Lecture, which will explore the history and changing interpretation of Ku'ukahola Heiau on Waimea on Hawaii Island. Also want to encourage anyone who's not already signed up for the HHF e-newsletter to sign up if these topics are of interest. And if you're here today, I'm assuming they are, at historichawaii.org to stay up to date on events and news related to heritage and preservation and history. And also please consider supporting HHF and our work by donating or becoming a member. You can visit the Join Us section at the historichawaii.org at our website. Wishing you and your loved ones good health and bright spirits, and hoping to see you next week.